There's a moment, one you'll never find in any police report, any courtroom transcript, any FBI file, where Meyer Lansky realized something that haunted him for the rest of his life. A realization born not from violence, not from betrayal, but from a single, quiet movement Lucky Luciano made in a dimly lit room. A movement so small it should have meant nothing, but it didn't, because in that instant, Lansky saw something he had never accounted for. A fear so deeply buried inside the most unshakable man in American crime that its very existence rewrote everything Meyer thought he knew. He once believed he could map Luciano's mind, every instinct, every calculation, every shadow. But that night, something slipped through the cracks, something Lucky didn't mean to reveal. Or maybe, something he could no longer hide. And here's the part no one ever tells you. Lansky wasn't afraid of the gesture itself. He was afraid of what it meant. Because if Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, could still be ruled by a fear he couldn't kill, then the entire empire they built was resting on a ghost nobody had seen until that moment. Tonight, we open the door to that room, the smoke, the silence, the stare that didn't match the map, and the movement, barely the twitch of a finger, that exposed the truth Meyer Lansky spent a lifetime trying to understand. What was the fear Lucky Luciano buried, and why did it finally break through? To answer that, we have to go back to the moment when the room held its breath, and Meyer realized he wasn't 3 steps ahead. He was already losing the game. The room was quiet. Too quiet. A quiet that felt arranged, like someone had cleaned the air just to make silence louder. A single lamp threw a soft circle of light across the table. The rest of the room belonged to the shadows. Smoke drifted slowly, moving like secrets no dared to say out loud. Meyer Lansky sat still, hands folded, eyes sharp behind the weak shine of his glasses. He looked calm. He looked in control. But inside, he was running calculations he didn't yet understand. Across from him sat Charles Lucky Luciano, legs crossed, shoulders relaxed, a cigarette burning between his fingers, almost forgotten. He looked like a man who slept through storms and woke up stronger. But something felt off. Meyer had spent years believing he knew this man better than anyone alive. He studied Luciano the way others studied scripture, line by line, shadow by shadow. He believed there was no move Lucky could make that he couldn't predict. Until that night. Because as the smoke curled upward, Luciano shifted. A small, simple movement. Barely anything. But it cut through Meyer's confidence like a cold blade. A gesture that didn't fit the map. A reaction that didn't match the man. A glimpse of something Lucky never showed. Something buried. Something old. Something dangerous. Meyer didn't know it yet. But that quiet movement was about to change everything he believed. And the real question wasn't what Lucky did. It was why he did it. A question that Lansky couldn't shake. A question that pulls us deeper into the story, because the answer doesn't live in this room. It lives in the past. And once we go there, nothing will look the same again. Before the smoke-filled rooms, before the secret meetings, before the empire, there were just 2 boys trying to survive a world that didn't care if they lived or died. Meyer Lansky first met Charles Luciano on streets where trust was a luxury and fear was a currency. Luciano had sharp eyes and a sharper instinct. Meyer had a quiet mind that never stopped working. Together, they understood something no one else around them seemed to grasp. In a world ruled by muscle, brains had to find each other. They weren't brothers by blood, but they became brothers by necessity. Lucky respected Meyer because he moved different, calm, deliberate, always watching, and Meyer admired Lucky because he carried himself like nothing could break him. No beating, no threat, no enemy. On those early days, Lucky looked untouchable, made of steel, a force born from the streets themselves, and Meyer believed he could see straight through him. He knew Lucky's tells, his temper, his confidence, his ambition. He knew the smile he used when he wanted something, and the silence he used when he already had it. He knew the way Lucky scanned a room, the way he chose a seat, the way he never showed fear even when fear filled the air like poison. At least, that's what Meyer thought. Because even in those early years, there were moments, small ones, that didn't fit the pattern. A pause that lasted a bit too long. A glance toward a dark alley that didn't match the conversation. A tension in Lucky's jaw when someone walked behind him. Tiny fractures in the image of the unshakable man. Meyer noticed the cracks, but he dismissed them. Everyone had nerves, everyone had instincts, everyone had a past. He never imagined those cracks came from something deeper, something Lucky refused to name, something that shaped him long before the power, long before the money, long before the legend. Back then, Meyer trusted his own mind. He trusted his understanding. He trusted the map he believed he was building of Lucky's soul. But the truth was already there, hiding in the shadows of their friendship. Some things about Lucky Luciano were never meant to be mapped. And the gesture Meyer witnessed years later, the one that shattered everything, had its roots right here, in this bond built on survival, and in the secrets Lucky never shared. Because even the strongest partnerships carry ghosts, and one of those ghosts was about to wake up. Meyer Lansky always said that every man was a pattern waiting to be solved. Some men were simple, 2 or 3 repeating moves. Others were a little harder, like broken puzzles missing pieces. But Lucky Luciano, to Meyer, he wasn't a puzzle. He was a system. A living map of instincts, reactions, strategies. And Meyer believed he had spent years drawing that map with careful hands. He studied Lucky the way a man studies a storm. Not with fear, but with precision. He knew how Lucky thought in danger, how he calculated risk, how he hid anger behind a quiet smile, how he turned fear into control before anyone even noticed the shift. Meyer believed he had it all charted out. If Lucky leaned back, he was confident. If he tapped his cigarette twice, he was deciding something important. If he narrowed his eyes, he already knew the answer. Every gesture, every silence, every breath, Lansky had assigned meaning to all of them. He built an entire mental blueprint of Luciano's mind, a blueprint he trusted more than any gunman they had ever hired. And the more Lucky grew in power, the more Meyer believed his map was perfect. They survived ambushes, betrayals, rival bosses, crooked cops, political storms, and every time, Luciano reacted exactly the way Meyer expected. Logical, clean, sharp as a blade. Meyer started thinking no one in the world understood Lucky like he did. Not the FBI, not rival bosses, not even Lucky himself. It wasn't arrogance, it was math. And math didn't lie. At least, that's what Meyer believed. But all maps have a flaw, a blind spot, a place the cartographer never bothered to explore because he assumed it didn't matter. And Lucky Luciano had a blind spot buried deep inside him. Something Meyer couldn't calculate, couldn't predict, couldn't fit into his perfect system. A fear with no logic, a scar with no pattern, a truth that didn't obey the rules Meyer trusted. The night Lucky made that quiet movement, the one that cracked Meyer's confidence, it hit him harder than anything. His map was missing the most important piece, and without that piece, everything he thought he understood was already wrong. Because Lucky wasn't just a system, he was a system built on a wound Meyer had never seen, but one that was about to reveal itself. Pressure doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in, slow, quiet, patient, just like the streets that raised them. And in the months leading to that night, the pressure around Lucky Luciano didn't just rise, it coiled. There were whispers of bosses turning restless, rival crews pushing boundaries they once feared to cross, federal eyes growing sharper, watching every shadow Lucky stepped into, old enemies resurfacing like debts that refused to stay buried. The world around him was tightening its grip, but the outside pressure, the rivals, the agents, the betrayals, that wasn't the real weight. The real weight came from inside. Lucky began to carry himself differently, not weaker, not fearful, just quieter. He stayed longer in meetings but spoke less. He scanned rooms a second time, sometimes a third. He paused before entering places he used to walk into without a thought. For anyone else, it looked like strategy, a leader being cautious, a boss staying alive. But Meyer saw more than the surface. At least, he thought he did. He watched Lucky's silence grow heavier each week. He watched the calm become too calm. He watched the confidence harden into something tighter, colder. Meyer tried to diagnose it the way he diagnosed everything: pattern, logic, reason, pressure from the other families, he told himself, heat from the feds, a play he hasn't revealed yet. That was the story he believed, because it fit the map he'd spent years building. But something didn't fit. Lucky started picking certain seats in rooms even when they weren't the most strategic. He kept his back farther from the door than usual. He watched reflections in windows, mirrors, even metal surfaces. Small things. Things most men would do out of instinct. But Lucky wasn't most men. He was calculated, controlled, predictable. So why were these movements different? One evening, as they stepped out of a meeting, Lucky froze for half a second, just half, before walking toward the street. Meyer noticed. He filed it away. He told himself it was nothing. But the cracks were widening, and for the first time, Meyer felt something he couldn't explain. A tension he couldn't place on his mental board. A shift he couldn't label. Lucky wasn't changing. He was remembering something the streets had taught him long before power, before vision, before empire. A lesson carved into the bone. A fear so old it carried no words. Meyer sensed it, but he didn't understand it. Not yet, because the truth wasn't in the meetings, or the rivals, or the pressure. The truth was waiting in that one quiet movement Lucky was about to make, the one that would expose everything Meyer had missed, everything he had misread, everything Lucky never wanted anyone to see. The night it happened wasn't special at first glance. No gunfight, no threat, no warning. Just a meeting in a dim back room of a quiet club, a place where secrets felt at home. The lamp overhead flickered like it was nervous to witness what was about to unfold. The walls were covered in old wood panels, worn smooth by time and smoke. A thin haze floated above the table where Lansky and Luciano sat, as if the air itself was listening. 3 other men were in the room, soldiers, loyal but tense. They spoke in low voices, arguing over a message from a rival crew pushing too close into their territory. Lucky listened. Or at least, he looked like he was listening. But Meyer watched him more closely than anyone else. Something in Lucky's stillness felt wrong. Too still. Too controlled. Like a man holding his breath without meaning to. "Charlie," one of the soldiers said, "they're testing us. We need to hit back before someone gets bold." No answer. Lucky just stared at the table, eyes half in shadow. Meyer felt the shift. Not in the room. In Lucky. The kind of shift you only notice when you've spent a lifetime reading a man. "Charlie," Meyer said quietly. Lucky lifted the cigarette to his lips. The ember glowed weakly, then faded. That's when the moment happened. It was small. So small anyone else would have missed it completely. Lucky's eyes flicked. Not toward the rival men. Not toward Meyer. Not toward the map spread on the table. They flicked toward the door. Not the main door. Not the exit. But a side door, half hidden by shadows. The kind of door only someone who feared that room would ever care about. A door behind him. Lucky shifted his chair just an inch, barely anything. But the legs scraped the floor with a soft sound that cut straight through Meyer's chest. It wasn't the movement itself. It was the intention behind it. Lucky Luciano, a man who had stared down assassins, police raids, betrayals, was repositioning himself because he didn't want anyone behind him. Meyer felt a cold realization crawl over him. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't calculation. This wasn't the controlled, brilliant, hardened Lucky he mapped for years. This was fear. Not new fear. Old fear. Fear that lived deep, deep inside. Fear with roots. Lucky didn't speak. He didn't look shaken. He didn't show anything on his face. But Meyer saw it. He saw the tightness in Lucky's jaw, the way his fingers paused on the cigarette, the way his shoulders drew in by a fraction, the way his eyes refused to leave that darkened door. It hit Meyer like a punch he didn't see coming. This wasn't a reaction to rivals. This wasn't pressure from the outside world. This was something else entirely. A memory, a wound, a ghost. Meyer tried to mask his surprise, but something in him broke open. He whispered, "Charlie, what was that?" Lucky didn't answer for several seconds. Then, almost too softly to hear, "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Meyer knew it, and Lucky knew Meyer knew. In that one quiet gesture, that single inch of movement, the map Meyer had trusted for years collapsed. Because a man who moves like that isn't thinking about enemies in the room. He's thinking about enemies from the past. Enemies who left scars no power could erase. Enemies who taught him a lesson he never forgot. A lesson Meyer was about to understand for the first time. Fear doesn't start in adulthood. It starts in the years when a boy is too small to fight back and too proud to scream. Lucky Luciano learned that truth long before he became Lucky. Back when he was just Salvatore, a kid from Lercara Fritti shoved into the streets of New York with more enemies than choices. The Lower East Side wasn't a neighborhood, it was a proving ground. And boys like him didn't get to grow up without bleeding first. Long before power, before loyalty, before empire, there was a night Lucky never forgot. A night when 4 older boys cornered him in an alley. He was young, smaller but already stubborn. He spit at one of them, refused to back down. It was the kind of courage people admire in stories, but in real alleys, courage only gets you hurt. They beat him until his ears rang and the ground shook under his skull. They dragged him by the collar. They laughed while he tried to stand only to fall again. One held him down. Another stepped behind him. Where Lucky couldn't see. That was the moment. Not the beating. Not the pain. The moment he couldn't see the person behind him. That blind spot, that helpless angle, that single second where the world turned into darkness and breathing felt impossible. That stayed with him. It carved something permanent inside him. Never let anyone stand behind you. Never give your back. Never lose sight. Later in life, he survived kidnappings, ambushes, betrayals. He was left for dead in 1929. Beaten, stabbed, scarred, tossed on the beach like trash. They attacked from behind then too. Survival made him powerful, but trauma made him careful. He built an empire on strategy, but he built his instincts on memory. And that's why that quiet movement in the meeting room wasn't a strategy. It was a reflex. A reflex older than the mafia, older than power, older than any enemy still walking the streets. It was a boy remembering a lesson written in blood. Meyer Lansky had never factored fear into Lucky's behavior, because Lucky never showed it. He hid it under confidence, control, iron discipline. But the fear was always there, buried deep, shaping every choice, every seat he picked, every exit he watched, every shadow he measured. Meyer finally understood. Lucky wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of not seeing it coming, afraid of the dark angle behind him, afraid of the unseen strike, afraid of repeating a moment he spent years trying to erase. And most shocking of all, Lucky had carried this fear silently for decades, without ever letting it weaken him. But now Meyer knew, and knowing changed everything, because once you see the wound inside a legend, you can never see the legend the same way again. Meyer Lansky always believed intelligence was his shield, his weapon, his advantage over a world built on fists and bullets. He trusted calculations more than emotions, patterns more than memories, logic more than instinct. And for years, that approach worked. He read men like open books, knew their weaknesses, their desires, their lies. But Lucky Luciano, Meyer thought he understood him better than anyone, He believed they were two halves of the same machine. Lucky handled the heat, the charisma, the danger. Meyer handled the mind, the structure, the precision. But after seeing that tiny movement, that subtle shift toward the hidden door, Meyer felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He realized he had been wrong, dangerously wrong. He had built a map of Luciano's mind, but it was a map drawn with clean lines, straight edges, perfect angles. There was no place on that map for trauma, no space for ghosts, no room for the fears Lucky buried so deep he pretended they never existed. Meyer understood strategy. He understood power. He understood survival. But he never understood the shadows inside his friend. He had studied Lucky's moves, but not his scars. He predicted reactions, but ignored the wounds shaping them. He read Lucky's confidence, but never recognized the storm beneath it. In that moment, reality hit him like a cold slap. I studied him too much, and felt him too little. He had treated Lucky like a system, a machine of logic, calculation, pattern. But Lucky wasn't a system. He was a man who had learned to hide fear behind strength, a man who had built an empire on top of old wounds, a man whose silence was louder than any threat. Meyer felt the ground shift under the weight of this truth. If he had missed this, what else had he missed? How many decisions had Lucky made because of fear Meyer never accounted for? How many risks had he taken to avoid ghosts Meyer didn't even know existed? How much of their empire had been shaped by a wound hidden behind a calm face? Meyer wasn't just shocked, he was humbled. Because the moment that tiny movement exposed the truth, Lansky understood one thing. You can map a man's mind, but you cannot map his pain. And Lucky's pain was still alive, still guiding him, still shaping him, still dangerous. After that night, nothing between Meyer and Lucky looked the same. Not the partnership, not the power structure, not the future they'd imagined. It wasn't because Lucky grew weaker. He didn't. If anything, he became sharper, harder, more aware of every shadow in every room. The change wasn't in Lucky, it was in Meyer. Because once you see the wound inside a man, you can't pretend it isn't there. You can't unsee the thing he spent a lifetime hiding. You can't return to the illusion that everything he does comes from confidence alone. Meyer began watching Lucky differently, not as a strategist observing a partner, but as a friend seeing a truth he had ignored for years. He noticed how Lucky always sat where he could see the exits. He noticed how he slowed his steps when someone walked behind him. He noticed how he scanned every room twice, even rooms they controlled. These weren't quirks. These weren't habits. These weren't strategic choices. They were defenses built from childhood fear. Fear that shaped decisions more than any rival family. Fear that influenced choices more than power ever did. And it changed the mafia in ways no one realized. When it came time to reorganize the old structure, Lucky pushed for something new. The commission. A system where one man wouldn't be cornered with all the power. A structure built on shared control, balanced risk, multiple exits. Not just politically smart, but emotionally necessary. Meyer understood that now. He saw the pattern he had missed. Lucky didn't avoid absolute power out of caution. He avoided it because absolute power puts a target on one man's back, on one angle, one blind spot. And Lucky would never again allow himself to stand alone in that blind spot. Even alliances were shaped by fear. His push for diplomacy with other families wasn't just strategy. It was survival through visibility. No shadows behind him. No silent threats waiting in the dark. Meyer also changed. He stopped assuming. Stopped believing he could predict Lucky like a math problem. Stopped trusting the old map. And a new layer rose between them. Respect mixed with something heavier. Empathy. Because now Meyer understood that Lucky's strength wasn't the absence of fear. It was the ability to lead while carrying it. But knowing the truth also meant understanding something darker. If Lucky's fear ever resurfaced in the wrong moment, it had the power to break everything they'd built. The past wasn't gone, it was sleeping. and now Meyer knew exactly how easily it could wake. In the end, the story doesn't return to the smoke-filled room, but it never really leaves it either, because that one quiet movement, the shift of a chair, the flick of eyes toward a darkened door, became a window into something Meyer Lansky never expected to see: the humanity inside the legend, the wound inside the warrior, the boy inside the king. For decades, Lucky Luciano walked through life like a man untouched by fear. He stood in front of danger, not behind it. He led armies, not crowds. He made decisions that shaped an entire era. But no matter how high he climbed, no matter how strong he became, no matter how many enemies he buried, some fears don't die. They just learn to hide. And that's what Meyer finally understood. Power doesn't erase the past. It just covers it with nicer clothes. Trauma doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the architecture of a man, quiet, unseen, but always there, shaping every beam and brick. When Meyer replayed that silent movement in his mind, the way Lucky shifted, the way his eyes found the door, the way his jaw tightened, he realized something simple and devastating. Why would a man like Lucky bury a fear so deep? Because he had to. Because if the world saw it, they'd use it. Because if his enemies sensed it, they'd strike. Because if his own people noticed it, they'd question his throne. Lucky didn't bury the fear to hide weakness. He buried it to stay alive. And as Meyer stood years later, looking back at the empire they built, he understood the final truth. You can map power. You can map strategy. You can map a man's rise. But you cannot map the shadows he carries. And Lucky Luciano's shadow was the real architect of everything he became.